Okay. So welcome everyone. I'm your host, Jenny G. Cousins, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Soul to Soul Connections with Jeni Ji. In order to catch all the shows, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can catch me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter under Jenny Cousins. Now on today's episode, I want to thank my guest for his bravery and courage for coming on to share his very personal traumatic journey and story with me. His name is Billy Dinkel from Long Prairie, Minnesota. And Billy was sexually abused as a child and molested. And he is here to share his journey with us all. And thank you, Billy, for taking the time to come on and speak to me.
Well, Jenny, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. As we talked earlier, I think these stories are very important. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about childhood sexual abuse and to talk about healing.
Yes, yes. So how old were you when you were starting to get molested, sexually molested?
So it's my recollection that I was 8 years old. So the summer of my eighth birthday, there was, so from the ages of 8 to 12, so the summer of my 13th birthday is when it ended. So it began, 1976 was the summer of my 8th birthday.
Mm-hmm. Mm. How did you meet your abuser?
So it's a little complicated, but it's fairly, hopefully I'll explain it well enough. I come from a very large family, farm family, Catholic farm family in central Minnesota. My father owned several farms that we farmed, and my oldest sister, Mary Ellen, and her husband, Ken, that was Ken and Mary Ellen Otremba, purchased a farm directly across the country road from the home farm where I was being raised. Ken also came from a large family in a neighboring county, and one of his brothers was, we say mentally challenged. I'm not sure exactly how to put that nowadays, but I believe George was mentally challenged. He came to live with them in the springtime summer of 1976, to the best of my recollection. And as a farmhand, I found out many years later that George was, the reason he was brought there is they were having problems with him on the farm that Ken grew up on. So they knew about it when George came to that. So directly across the road, our houses were literally about 200 or 300 yards apart. George was he was born in 1958, so he was probably 19 years old at that time, or 19 or 20 at that time, and he was a live-in farmhand for his older brother, Ken, who was my brother-in-law, directly across the road, the country gravel road from the farm that I grew up on.
Okay. So what, how did he start to groom you? Because I know that a lot of the predators, there's a system, as I call it, that they did.
For sure. It's not looking back on it now as a mature older person, and looking back on how it was handled. He had done this before, and certainly after me, he had done it. He had continued for many more victims. George was, I was 8 years old. I was curious. I was going to school at a small Catholic grade school at the time, and I didn't have, trust me when I say that in the 1970s in a small Catholic school, we weren't learning body parts, and we weren't learning sexuality, and we weren't learning, we weren't being taught the names of body parts and how that works at the age of 8. So at like any boy at 8, 9, 10, years old, or in that time frame, or in a grammar school setting, we're getting curious how bodies work, and I was curious about things, right? So George brought that up to me, and it originally started, if you remember, like the J.C. Penney catalogs or the Sears and Roebuck catalogs, right? They sold women's underwear, and they sold bras and panties, right? So George would say, hey, I remember specifically one time in the yard that he said, hey, did you guys get the new Sears catalog? And I said, yeah. And he goes, do you want to bring it over? And so that was kind of the beginning. It was curiosity. And it was, hey, I he had done that before. He understood that I was going to be curious about that. And it became kind of the, hey, George is my friend, and I'm going to learn some of the naughty stuff from George, from my new friend, George. And so that's how it started, by kind of, pun intended, to arousing my curiosity, right? Somehow understanding that I wasn't going to obviously learn that stuff from my parents at home, because we were a strict Catholic family in the country. And I went to a very strict Catholic grammar school, and we weren't being taught, body parts or learning about those things. So the curiosity is there. It's there in every human being as they grow up and as they're starting to slightly mature. You are curious whether you're watching TV or listening to the radio or you're seeing billboards. You're starting to wonder, when, I'm a boy, but what does that mean? And so George plucked pride into and worked on that curiosity of an 8-year-old boy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're just a child. You don't know any better.
You hardly know.
Yeah.
You know what's wrong, because you've been told that it's all wrong, but you don't know what you're supposed to know. Like, it starts as a snowfall. It starts as a slight sprinkling of dusting of snow, right? But once the avalanche starts of sexual abuse, there's no stopping. It's very difficult for an 8-year-old boy who might weigh 60 or 70 pounds or 80 pounds to stop a 200-pound plus man from having his way with him, right? So what starts as a few snowflakes of curiosity ends up, you're buried or you're tumbling down the mountain of it's not curiosity anymore. Pretty soon it's dangerous, and it's hurtful, and it's physically hurting, and it certainly does. Obviously, as I found out throughout my life, it's certainly done some psychological damage, mental damage.
When you're a child like that, I mean, you don't understand. And this is why I wanted to talk about this, because if there are any children out there, or anybody out there, it's really important to let it out and not hold it in. Because, you're a child. Nobody can point the finger and said it's a child's fault at all.
Yeah, absolutely. It's taken me a lot of years, a lot of decades to realize that, to come to grips with the fact that it wasn't my fault. In any way, shape, or form was it my fault. That curiosity that I had wasn't something that I am to blame for.
No.
Because as a child, you're supposed to be curious. You're supposed to want to know more. You're supposed to want to know how the world works. You're supposed to want to know things, right? And so this message is as important for those children, but it's as important for anyone who's a parent, anyone who's a grandparent, anyone who's a coach or an uncle or an aunt. These messages, these stories, and I believe that more people than we are afraid to admit have these stories. But the most important people, I think, these stories are most important to, the people that these stories are most important to, are the survivors or the past victims of childhood sexual abuse or molestation or sexual adolescent, or not, when anyone under 18, there's no one under 18 that can legally consent. So if there are so many victims, if the searches and I mean if the studies are correct, and I believe they are actually quite low in their numbers or the data, 1 in 3 girls is sexualized before they're 18 years old. And keeping in mind, anyone under 18 years old can't consent. So 1 in 3 girls are sexualized without their approval or without their consent. 1 in 6 boys, and there's some studies that say 1 in 5 boys now. It's unbelievable. And it doesn't matter if obviously the percentages are slightly higher in poor communities or those that are less fortunate, but this data is straight all the way from poor classes all the way up to the wealthy. It doesn't, through middle class, through upper middle class, all the way to the extremely wealthy. It's a human condition. It's not a financial condition. It is a human condition. This is a problem that affects everyone across the board. Are the percentages slightly higher? Certainly they are in underprivileged communities. Yep, and diverse communities, they certainly are. But it is across the board a problem. And so these messages, these stories, I say that my story is an important story, not because it's about me, but it's one of the most important stories because of the topic, and the topic is childhood sexual abuse.
Yes, and that's why when like we first connected, I wanted to really get it out and emphasize it even more, rather than too many things get brushed away and ignored. And, so many things are coming out nowadays, and it's time. It's time. How long did this go on for?
So, and again, I always say it was almost 5 years. It probably a good solid 5 years of more than weekly. I mean, George, we worked side by side on these farms daily, when in the evenings and sometimes before school, and certainly on the weekends, and then all summer. So if I always, I'd like to someday, I wish that I could forget the whole thing, but when I try to remember how often or how long or how terrible the abuse was, I know that it happened more than once a week, and I know that it happened to me for about 5 years. And so, that's hundreds and hundreds of times. And I don't generally count the touching and the molesting. It's literally, we'll get into some of the more detailed stuff hopefully later in this conversation, but it lasted for what seemed to an 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old child. It lasted a long, long time. For any, we think about, I think about Elizabeth Smart, right? She was abducted and she was kept and horribly treated for 9 months approximately. And that's not the norm. The norm isn't that you're abducted by a stranger and kept in the woods.
Yeah.
The norm is that it's an uncle, or it's a stepdad, or it's a brother, or it's an aunt, or it's, that's the norm. It's the coach, it's the priest, it's the Boy Scout leader. And so for me, what started out as a trusted, hey, my sister and my brother-in-law trust this person enough to have them live in their house. I must feel safe. I must be, and being a naive boy, being raised in a Christian, kind of a naive Christian trusting home, I believed that I could trust this person, and unfortunately for me, it was a situation where I couldn't trust that person. And so 5 years, I say 8 through 12, it's probably somewhere around my 13th birthday that it stopped. The summer of my 13th birthday that it stopped.
Goodness. Well, yeah. I mean,
It's not, and I mean
even
it,
once is too much, right?
yeah.
And you went through that for
Right.
way too long. But you know, even once is not acceptable by, as far as I'm concerned, you know,
Right.
with a child.
Right. It's terrible to say. Like we think about, I have a dear friend, a dear friend, and she said, you know, when I first told her about it, she said, my God, it took me years to get over my rape. And it took me, and that was one night in college that changed my whole life, you know. And she said, I can't imagine what a young boy who doesn't even understand what's happening, for that to happen over and over and over again. And we have to remember, I really want to emphasize this point, that childhood sexual abuse is different than you know, we have to define it for people, because otherwise people want to believe the least amount of damage was done, right? They want to believe, people want duckies and bunnies, right? They want rainbows and unicorns, and they want happiness. And you know, you can't look at Facebook or Twitter and not see just happy things, right? I'm on vacation, or I got a new car. People want happiness. What our mission is here, Jenny, and I believe that part of me telling my story is to change we're changing the paradigm around child sexual abuse, and we're going to define it. And some people are going to be uncomfortable with what really happens.
Mm-hmm.
One time is too many.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
300 or 400 times is unbelievable. But we have to explain to people how terrible it can be for children, and how terrible it really is for children.
Yeah.
When adults are not helping them.
Yeah. Did you tell anybody about it?
The first, I did.
Mm-hmm.
I told, the first few months were that grooming kind of, hey, this is cool, whatever fun part. And then pretty soon it went farther than I wanted it to go, right? He was touching me and holding my arms, and it was forced, and he was, I'm not sure exactly what your listeners want to know, but again, being more graphic with it, there was ejaculation was starting, and there was some forced this and forced sex, right? So not necessarily rape in the common definition of rape, but rape in a dictionary, or in the Webster's form. So there was some of that, and there was oral, and there was forced oral, and so different things were starting, where I was afraid. I was terribly afraid and didn't know how to stop it. And he was so much bigger than me that I couldn't stop it. So I took all of the strength that I had, and I've been told by a lot of therapists and a lot of people that it's very uncommon. But I summoned a bunch of courage for an 8-year-old boy, and I stood in front of my mother in the kitchen, and I told her, Mom, George is touching me, and he's touching me where I pee, and it hurts me. It hurts me, and that was the first time I reached out, and I'll never forget it. She was kneading dough, and she had flour on her apron, and it was a daytime. I'm assuming that school hadn't started yet, because it was daytime, and I just remember how the kitchen was set up and everything. She said, she raised her hand like she was going to slap me, and she said, "Shush, he is not. Don't ever say that again." And as hard as I bet that was for me to hear, right? Help wasn't coming from my mom. At that new moment, I knew that I was not going to be helped by my mom. There was no way I was going to tell my father, because my father was a rageaholic, was absolutely a rager. I felt that I would be beaten severely if I told my father. And so I knew that at that moment even as an 8-year-old boy, I knew that help wasn't coming from my mom. Later on in my life, I managed to as I learned more about my situation and my healing, I was able to forgive my mother for that, and we'll maybe talk more about that in the later on. But so that was the first time I reached out, was to my mother a few months after it had started. So probably June, July, August. So let's say like September or August of that year, I had said, hey, something's going on here that I don't understand. Can you help me? And I did not get the help that I needed.
Because I know you had also tried speaking to a priest.
I did. That was the second. What I remember is the second person that I talked to. This was much later, so I was 9 years old, I think, when I talked to our priest at our Catholic church, where ironically, now keep in mind, George was a little bit mentally challenged, or he didn't have a driver's license. He could vote, but he didn't drive. He didn't have his own household. He lived with my brother and sister, or my brother-in-law and sister. And so George was allowed to serve Mass at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Long Prairie. So if you think about who serves Mass, generally it's young boys, right? So that gives George access to young boys, unlimited access when you think about it, to young boys. I have been contacted by two young boys, not later now, in the past 2 years, I've been contacted by two who said that George had touched them in the church. So when I was 9 years old, I reached out to, this was a very difficult thing. Father Ebner was a big, bald guy. I was terrified of Father Ebner. To me, to a 9-year-old boy who's raised in a strict Catholic home, he was the representation of God, right? Of Jesus. And so I was terrified of Father Ebner, and I told Father Ebner that George, I basically said the same thing I said to my mother. George is touching me, and I'm afraid that that of George, and it hurts me. And I'll never forget this, Jeni. I'll never forget what he said. He kind of laughed in an uncomfortable, kind of awkward way, and he said, well, Billy, what do you want me to do about it? And I'll never forget that. As a boy, as a 9-year-old boy, I'll just never forget that feeling of knowing that he wasn't going to be able to help me, knowing that he was not going to help me. Now, I don't know if later on he talked to my parents about that, or if he mentioned it to my mom, or I don't know. I'll never know that, I guess. But my father gave a considerable amount of money each week to the church. And I think that, you don't want to upset the money train. And that's kind of the whole idea behind not upsetting the apple cart, right? So the second person I reached out to was Father Ebner at St. Mary's of Mount Carmel Catholic Church in Long Prairie.
Because you also tried writing a letter to your brother when you were 10. Yeah.
It's probably, I would say it's 10 or 11. It's difficult as a child to remember the dates. My brother, Charlie Dinkel, was a smoke jumper, or was fighting fires out west. He was a wildfire fighter. And we corresponded periodically through letters. We didn't write because we didn't have text. And so, and Charlie was one of my heroes when I was growing up. He was my older brother, right? He was 14 years older than me, and he played college football, and he was an amazing high school athlete. And now he was, oh my God, he was out west in the Rocky Mountains fighting fires. This was amazing to me, to a 10 or 11-year-old boy. And I remember sending him the first few letters that I sent to him, my mother helped me with, right? So, hi, how are things going on out west? It's here, it's the same. Dad works us hard, those kind of letters, right? Farm letters. And I remember at the end of one of my letters, and I don't know if it actually, I can't say for sure that I actually made it to Charlie, right? Because my mother would sometimes help me mail those letters, quote unquote, help me fold it and get it in there and make sure it had the right address on it and put the stamp on it. And I don't know if this was one of those letters she helped me with, or if it was one of the letters that I did myself and he did realize it. I know that I got an answer from him. And the answer I got from him didn't mention what I had read. The last few sentences I said was, George is touching me and I need your help. Please help me. Or, kind of the Kilroy, help me. And his return letter was fairly short. I remember the after that one, and it didn't mention anything. The only thing it mentioned was, listen to your mom and dad, listen to mom and dad, always do what they say, and just be a good boy. And, and my heart sank when I read his answer, right? Because no help was coming from one of my heroes, one of my absolute heroes. And so I can't say definitively that he received my letter without some changes, if you know what I mean, from my mom. If she had edited or rewrote it or did something different. What I can say is that at that moment in my life, I knew I was alone. I wasn't getting out of that the childhood sexual abuse, that was the rape and the sodomizing and the forced oral and the oral on me. I wasn't getting out of that with help from my brother. At that moment, I knew that my brother wasn't going to help. And so that was I know, that was essentially the third time that I had reached out to an adult who,
in your family,
yeah.
especially, now you're thinking, I've tried to, give my voice and say my voice and share my voice. And
you hope, right? You even as a child, you're hoping, like, I'm way past Santa Claus helping me. I'm just trying to think of the good things they're trying to teach me. So I'm trying to say, okay, now I need your help. I need you to help me. And when children don't make this stuff up.
No.
Children don't know enough about sex and sexual abuse to make these things up. It's incredible how the lack of concern and the lack of accountability and the small percentages of justice that children get when they're sexually abused, because we just can't believe them, or they're unreliable witnesses, so it's very frustrating to as a child reach out and not have someone believe you. So one of the messages that I make sure that I could try to convey is, please listen to the child when it's trying to tell you something. Listen to your children when they're trying to say something. Listen to your children when they're trying to tell you that they're having a problem at school, when their teacher they're not comfortable with someone, or they don't want to hug someone, or they don't want to be alone in a room with someone. Listen to your children. Like, try to read what they're saying, because they're very small people in a giant world, in literally a giant's world. So to your child, you are a giant, and try not to be too angry with the child, try not to be too physical with the child, but most importantly, from the childhood sexual abuse point of view, please try to listen to your child, because they will tell you. They will try to tell you.
Yeah, children aren't going to make up stories about that. Something like that, they don't. And it just, it really makes me sick. I knew a family that her new husband was sexually molesting her daughters. And he went to jail, and she stayed with him. She stayed with him. And even after he got out of jail, she stayed with him. And after that point, I just did not really want to communicate as much with that family anymore, because it's thought, how could you stay with a monster like that, who is your husband, who is raping your children? That I was just, and then everybody cried when he eventually died. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, are you kidding
Right.
me? And so that's it's just astonishing when something happens similar to my son. And I raised hell. And long story short, the situation, I dealt with it immediately. And that whole daycare situation, they left the province, because there's no way in hell I was going to have anything like that ever happen as long it was anywhere near me. Like that was enough for me.
Yeah. And we want to believe that, right? We want as adults to think, well, I would protect my children with everything I had.
Yeah.
I would kill
Yeah.
a person, or I would do
Yeah.
whatever it takes. And then, I think we've learned more about shame in the last 5 years thankfully from people like Brene Brown and others, that's not really what happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that your stories, but like your friend,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
shame takes over, and I feel so bad, but these people are accomplices. They are accomplices in felonious crimes against children. And I feel bad that they're shamed and they don't want to be embarrassed in their communities, and they don't want to lose I call it losing your front seat in church. I understand that. But more important than your reputation, and more important than your shame and your little red face, is a child. A child that could be damaged for life if it
Oh,
doesn't get the right love and support and help. And that's such an important message that we have, because everyone believes that they're going to do the right thing until they're actually confronted with it. And then you realize, maybe I'm too shamed. Maybe I'm not the right person, because that child is looking for an absolute hero. And sometimes people can't stand up. My mom didn't have what it took to be an absolute hero.
mm-hmm.
We don't know what it was. Was she afraid of my father? Would she afraid of what the community might say? Was she abused when she was little and she froze? But at the time of test, my mother was a wonderful person, but when it came time to saving that little boy, that little 8-year-old boy, she failed. She failed that test.
And
My sister, who was a wonderful person, failed that test. She failed that test.
yeah.
So that brings up another topic, or another segue a little bit, that there were other people that knew that I was being abused. So Ken, you remember George's older brother who lived across the road, who was my sister's husband. Ken had walked in on George abusing me several times. My sister Mary Ellen had walked in on George having sexually abusing me several times. So it wasn't just my mother and the priest and my brother Charlie, and there was it was almost a unified front against the truth. So Ken and Mary Ellen not only knew what George had been doing to other children at the farm he came from, at the farm Ken and George grew up on, but Ken and Mary Ellen knew what George was doing to me. Had seen it firsthand, and didn't contact the proper authorities, and didn't remove George from children. He was still serving mass. He was still an altar boy with these other children. He was still, the priest knew, and George was still an altar boy at the church. So this idea that they had done everything they could, and it was somehow, there's more to it than what Billy's saying, it's just not true. It's just simply not true. There was ample opportunity to minimize the trauma that little 8-year-old boy, the little 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old boy, little Billy was feeling. There was ample opportunity to minimize that trauma, and it wasn't, because of shame, because of not wanting to lose their front seat in church, and not wanting to be embarrassed, and not wanting to, not wanting to admit that it was true. I don't know, but there was ample opportunity to save that boy, and they didn't. So that sends a very, very, very dangerous message to that boy. Not only did we not save you, but what does that tell the child? It tells the child you're not worth saving. To us, our reputations are more important than you. So if you're an 8-year-old boy and you're getting sexually abused on the Dinkel farm in the 1970s, our reputation is more important than your physical safety. Just want you to know that, So that sends a dangerous psychological message to that 8-year-old boy too.
Yeah, and unfortunately it stays with a child. There's it really does. I mean, I've had a very traumatic life, to be honest, and I don't talk about it a lot. And I just went for like therapy. It was years ago, just for some kind of a healing for something small. And my friend brought me, and I was in there 3 hours, and I think I was only booked in for 45 minutes. And then when I came out, like, he just kind of looked at me, and I mean, he's a good friend of mine. And then when we were driving home, I just broke down and I started telling him things that nobody knows. And he's like, what? Like, what? He he was shocked. I'm a really strong person, and that's why I'm like a very spiritual person today, because of just many reasons. Did you ever have like any suicidal thoughts at all?
Well, I told, recently I was talking with a friend. It's been 2 years that I've been vocal and speaking out about what happened to me, about the trauma that I experienced when I was a child. And I was recently, in the past few months, talking with a friend about, I just was talking, we were going over suicidal thoughts and ideation, right? Thinking about suicide. And I asked her, I said, well, have you ever thought about killing yourself? And she said, no. And I'm like, what? Like, I've never heard of that before. And she said that, I've thought about suicide, but I've never thought about killing myself, And she said, well, have you thought about killing yourself? And I said, I've thought about killing myself since I was 8 years old, like almost every day since I was 8 years old. Now that sounds worse than it really is, right? I haven't thought about how I was going to do it, and was I really going to do it? And today I'm going to hang myself, and I'm going to, but as a boy growing up on the farm, there's big machinery around a lot. And we're sometimes climbing up silos, and we're on top of roofs, or we're in the barn, we're up on the top, there is ample opportunity to throw yourself in front of a machine, or jump off of a silo, or a grain silo, or there. So I have thought, I tell people that I've thought about suicide since I was 8 years old. Now and there's the reason that people say, why did you run away? When you're an 8-year-old boy in the country in central Minnesota, and you've been taught about heaven and hell, and how people who don't honor their father and mother go to hell, and they burn in hell forever. And there was nowhere for me to run. It wasn't like I was gonna run to town and tell people that I was being harmed on the farm, and then someone was gonna save me. That wasn't gonna happen. There was what happened, my option was to think about, okay, can I handle hell for the rest of my life, or for eternity? I mean, sorry, not for the rest, but for eternity. And I decided when I was 8 years old that I couldn't, that was not something I could do.
And I was going to read you some, but I have to.
When I was a senior in high school, I did attempt suicide. I had taken sleeping pills that I had slowly purchased over the course of several weeks, and my intent was to get numb enough and fall asleep enough and then shoot myself. And it didn't work out that. I mean, I think it was more of a cry for help, right? It was an attention. Like, hey, I need help. I need attention. I need someone to help me here. And so I did attempt suicide once, and I don't know, a normal person would say, well, that's not really an attempt at suicide. Well, whatever. But so yes, I have thought about almost my whole life, or at least I've ideated, right? Which is the idea of like being kind of romanticized by the idea of suicide. And never, interestingly enough, people would say, I as an adult, I did some things that I'm not proud of, and I think all of us do. I probably did a few more when I was self-medicating. And so I would hold these little trials in my head, and I would always be convicted, and the sentence would always be death. And thankfully, for me personally, thankfully, I never carried those out. But I would be sentenced to death by hanging, or I would be sentenced for shooting myself, or gunfire, firing squad, and I would be the executioner and the executed, and I never carried those out. And that might sound crazier than it really is, but idea is the thought of the pain ending, right? You don't really want to. I didn't really want to die. What I wanted was the pain to end. I wanted the memories to stop. I wanted the nightmares to stop.
Because I had read where you had started to get revenge on George. Started to take revenge when you're 13, around there. What did you do?
So I realized that I was never going. I needed to. My number one prayer, because because we were prayers, right? Because we were raised Catholic, and prayer was there. So what I asked God for was the strength to stop the sex, was the strength to stop the abuse. And so around the summer of my 13th birthday, which would be, which would have been about 5 years, I remember George was going to go down on me as perform fellatio on me. And as he was leaning down, he had left one leg of my pants on, and I had one, and he had left my shoes on. I had some tennis shoes, like, on the farm I had hand-me-downs, right? So I didn't have high quality shoes, but I had these tennis shoes, and I remember they're like white, I don't know, Keds or something, and they weren't Keds, but they were like a knockoff like that. And so, but he had left my shoes on, and this was my opportunity. This was going to happen now. And George didn't have really all of his teeth. He didn't take very good care of his teeth. Ironically, that's one of my triggers now, is the smell of decaying teeth, right? So as George was going down, I kicked him in his mouth with my heel, and I kicked him several times. And I had kicked, he didn't have all his teeth, but I had kicked 3. In the end, it was bloody, extremely bloody. And I kicked 3 of his teeth out. I think they had to pull a 4th one. I don't remember exactly the dental records, but so I knocked this wasn't like I was all of a sudden stronger than him. It was like I caught him in the right position. I remember Ken, my brother-in-law, coming into the room, and he was very angry. I got slapped in the head a couple times very hard by Ken. George was bleeding profusely. I remember they had to rush him to the dentist, and so yeah, right. And so in the end, right, this little boy is his own hero, right? So much like later in life, where I've got to go back and say, okay, mentally we gotta figure this out. Physically, at that 12 or 13-year-old age, in that summer of that 13th birthday, I had to save myself, because my mother wasn't saving me. My brother-in-law Ken wasn't saving me. My sister Mary Ellen wasn't saving me. My older brother Michael wasn't saving me. My brother Charlie wasn't saving me. My dad wasn't saving me. My mom wasn't. The priest wasn't. God wasn't saving me. It was up to me to save me. It was the only way that I was going to stop it. Not that I had super strength, or not that I did something heroic, but I saved myself when I had the opportunity. And so that my opportunity was when George was, leaning down, stroking himself and wasn't aware of what the situation was, and he wasn't holding both my arms or holding both my feet like he sometimes did, he would pull my pants down enough to leave my pants at my ankles, which then I couldn't, he did this hundreds of times. I couldn't struggle. My ankles were essentially tied by my pants, right? So this time, one of my legs was out, as I explained earlier, and it gave me the opportunity to kick George in the face a couple times. And I remember I got in a lot of trouble for that. I just remember my father being extremely angry about the anger issues that I had, and I thought that was the pot calling the kettle black. But they didn't ask why, mind you. No one, because they knew, right? They didn't have to ask why. They knew that why I kicked George, but they were still angry that it was going to cost them money to fix George's teeth and da 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 da. So I don't know if that was necessarily revenge. There were plenty of times in my life where I wanted to, where I did want to kill George.
Okay.
I didn't. I never acted on that, but.
Yeah. Can you see me?
I can't.
Oh, there we are. I don't know what happened. Okay.
Did it record?
Yeah. Yeah, the internet, I don't know what's going on, but it's, hopefully it will be okay. So now I know that, I know that George was convicted of second-degree sex crime with a 10-year-old boy. And he wasn't convicted for anything that he did to you, was he?
No. And I never had, I was so filled with shame that I didn't talk about it for years. I never really told anyone about it. George was never convicted for anything he had done to me or any of the other victims that he had on the farm or at the church at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Long Prairie. Or on the Dinkel farm or on the Otremba farms. He was never convicted of any of those crimes. I don't know that even any of those crimes were ever reported by my family or by the victims. Much later in life, he was at a Harding home in Stearns County, which is just outside of Little Falls, Minnesota. And he was, and anyway, this is public information. Anyone can read the court documents. He was caught with a 10-year-old boy, second-degree criminal sexual conduct with a minor, with a 10-year-old boy at that time. And that was a family member. I don't know, we don't know who, but someone had actually just come to visit him and brought their son to, I just can't imagine the stupidity or the ignorance or the naivete to bring someone almost like sacrifice, and they were alone in his room playing strip poker. This is public, this is public information. So,
yes, it is.
So that tells you the amount of just, I feel so, I've just this of it, and I want to say ignorance, but it's this belief in the, rainbows and unicorns and that bad things just don't happen. And what they said about George isn't true. Like, you would have to be so ignorant or so, let's just say it's stupid, to leave your 10-year-old boy with George alone in a room. I can't even fathom that. So George was convicted in 2004, I believe. He only got probation. No other victims were contacted. Family members of mine stood up for him. I can't. It makes me so angry to not, that none of us were. It was actually hidden from us, actually. So they tried to hide it from us. So it's an amazing secret that this family. One of the things that inspired me to start talking was one of my oldest brothers said to me once, when I said that I was going to start talking about it, he said, how dare you tell our family secrets to strangers? And I thought, wow, for a man who is so well read, how can you be so stupid and small-minded? You know, like, how can you not know that what happened was criminal, and by our family hiding that was also criminal? And the damage that those felonious crimes, they're felonies, that the damage that could do to children.
Yeah.
And then just pretend like it's like you're supposed to carry this burden to your grave. You're not supposed to talk about it. You're not supposed to tell anyone. You're not supposed to embarrass me. Like,
Yeah.
your embarrassment is more important than the health of a child.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
No,
I know.
you
I
want to use
know.
the
Yeah. I mean, like, how did you feel? Because I know George passed on February 24th, 2006. How did you feel when you knew that he had passed on? Did you know
You
right
know,
away?
no, no, it was kept. I mean, it wasn't like no one said, "Hey, George died." But I remember someone saying after, you know, the fact, and after, you know, a few months, maybe it was a few months or a few weeks, a couple months, let's say, and after he died, saying, "Oh, George died," and I thought, "Oh, why wouldn't you tell us that?" But I remember feeling to myself, I remember saying, well, I was that my fear was gone. Like, there was a small amount of fear that still lived inside of me, like a relief, maybe more of a relief, but I was just a little bit less afraid. And in all honesty, in bare bones honesty, it was a relief that I didn't have to kill him. That he was no longer going to hurt any more children.
Mhm.
And that burden had been lifted off of me
Yeah.
because I didn't save all of the children that were after me. This
Yeah.
guilt and the shame that I carried. And so I think a little bit of fear went away, and I was relieved, and I just felt like a little burden had been lifted off me.
Because I know that
Was it?
Jeffrey, sorry, go
Yeah,
on.
go ahead.
No, I was going to say that
I
Jeffrey Dion said that there's an average of 50 perpetrators, or there's an average of 50 victims per perpetrator.
yeah, which I
That's
think
crazy.
which
But
I
it,
think
yeah,
is low, right? Like,
yeah,
if George was 48 years old when he died, and he was virtually unregulated. Like, he was not like tethered in any way from having victim after victim after victim after victim. 13 victims, in addition to me, have contacted me, George's victims, hundreds of other victims, but 13 of George's victims have contacted me since I started speaking up.
there'll be more.
All of those victims were after me
Mhm.
from the Long Prairie area. So, and again, I want to reiterate that George had some mental deficiencies. And so I really hold a lot, my family, the adult members of my family, hold a lot of the blame and the guilt, and rightly so, the shame of allowing George to have victim after victim after victim after victim.
Mhm.
So a lot of that stands with the members of my family who were adults when George began his tyranny of childhood sexual abuse, his victimizing of people in Long Prairie, Minnesota, Todd County, Minnesota.
It's crazy. When did you start therapy? Because I know that, of course, you know, with your situation, you would have had to have started therapy to help you with that after.
Well, what was I didn't start like when I was a young person, I I fell into athletics. Was kind of I was a big kid, and I was a strong kid, and I was relatively coordinated, and so my therapy was athletics when I was in an adult, when I was going through becoming a young man. My therapy really became, I dove into basketball, I dove into football, and basketball really became my therapy at that time. When I attempted suicide my senior year, I was sexually assaulted by a middle school teacher when I was a senior, and that threw me back, into some of that childhood trauma. And so shortly after becoming, I was homecoming king, and then I was sexually assaulted by this teacher, and then I attempted suicide shortly after that. And so I was in 2 West, they call it, which is the mental health ward of the St. Cloud Hospital. And St. Cloud is a town in central Minnesota that is kind of a larger town, city of at that time probably 80,000 people. So they had the bigger hospitals, and so essentially that's when I was explained to me, like, I didn't talk about my childhood trauma there.
Mhm.
I talked about the stressors of being I didn't talk about the sexual assault. I didn't talk about the sexual abuse when I was a child. I just wanted to talk about my family and the stresses of being working so hard on the farm and trying to get your schoolwork done, and the mental stress of just being a kid, right? Just being a young person with all of the drama that goes on in high school, right? That was what I wanted to be. I wanted to be normal, right? I wanted to just be a normal kid. And I wanted the pain of all this pain and all these nightmares and all these thoughts to stop. When I actually started therapy was, it's a long story to get to therapy, but there was some therapy after I was an adult and I had dropped out of college and things like that because of my alcoholism and different things. And we call that, when we're working on the book or working on the story, we call that self-medication, right? I self-medicated for about a decade with alcohol.
Yeah.
And the attention of beautiful people, beautiful women. And so after my self-medicating days were over, and I knew that I was either if I wanted to do the things in my life that I wanted to do, I needed to sober up. Along with that came the idea that I needed to talk to someone. And so I started with, of course, because I was Catholic, I started with some therapy from priests and former priests and Christian therapists. And I broke up there was a gal that broke up with me when I sobered up, which is one of the reasons that we kind of ignited my sobriety. And I talked about that time is when I started to talk to people about how difficult and how hard I believed my life was inside my head, right? It wasn't until about 12 years ago that I decided that I knew I needed, when I was suffering from some severe depression, from some bad choices that I had made, and just life and the nightmares had come back, and the pressure and the anxieties. I went to the Meadows in Arizona, and the Meadows is a retreat for recovery from alcoholism or drug addiction or sex addiction or mental health issues, depression. They deal with depression. It wasn't until the Meadows until I was visiting the Meadows for 35 days in Arizona that I really told someone in a group, it was in group therapy, that I was violently sexually abused for a long period of time when I was a child. And I remember it quite clearly because I actually, was violent. Like they encouraged me to be violent. Like, hey, move out of the way, he's talking. And I smashed a chair up against the wall. Just finally being able to say out loud that that I was sexually abused, that I was held down and these hundreds of times I was tricked into having sex and finally admitting to myself that I was very angry about this and that I was very upset about what was allowed to happen to me by my family, by George for a long period of time. And so I've had a history of therapy, for decades, cognitive behavioral therapy, talk therapy. Right now I have, I think, a wonderful therapist that I appreciate very much, who's helped me come to grips with a lot of what happened to me. So therapy has played a large role in my life. And reading the assigned books, right? Understanding what Van der Kolk talks about when he talks about the body keeps score, and understanding that trauma is stored inside of my body. And the reason that physical activity and exercise and all of these things feels good for not just everyone, but for me especially, is because some of that trauma is still trapped inside my body.
And it can take, it's always there, you know what I mean? And it's just one day at a time. Like if there was anyone, like even a child who catches this episode, or anybody else that is currently being sexually abused or abused, what would you tell them that they should do? Like, what should they do? Like, what's the best thing that they should do?
Well, I think if a child sees this and they're being sexually abused and they're trying to figure out, first of all, you don't, this isn't your fault. What's happening to you isn't your fault. You deserve better. Every child deserves better than that. If you don't know who to talk to, please reach out to someone, to anyone.
Please.
If even if you're not sure, like, they can contact. I don't have the resources right in front of me, but there are umpteen million websites, right? We can talk to I am 1 in 6 or 1 in 6 organization, or any of these kind of organizations. There's a tremendous amount of people, but I highly recommend you not talk to people who are affiliated with the person who is abusing you. Talk to someone who's independent, right? So if you're in a domestic abuse situation and you want to get out, don't talk to someone who's affiliated, who knows your spouse or your partner, right? If you're a child who's being abused by a teacher, don't talk to that to another teacher. Talk to someone, find a police officer, talk to your parents, right? Because normal parents,
anybody until somebody listens, basically.
Right. Never give up, right? I'm so proud of that little boy that I was.
Yeah.
Because he never gave up. I mean, when, it's uncommon for children to want to reach out, to want it to end, but you have to talk to your parent. You have to reach out and just never stop reaching out. I don't care if you have to run in the middle of the street and scream until someone says, what is happening in your life? Talk to someone, reach out to people. I highly recommend it's not clergy. I highly recommend it's not someone affiliated with the abuser. There's probably better advice out there, but never give up, and the reason that you never give up trying to reach out is because you're worth it. You're worth it. You're worth it. You're worth it. Your life is worth it. You are worth it. You're worth the help. You're worth the health. You're worth the love, and you're worth the support. You are totally worth the support and the love.
Yeah. I would recommend, talk to everybody, anybody really who's going to actually listen and do something, and keep talking until something is actually done.
Yeah. And little children probably aren't going to see this, so they're not really going to.
No, but there's other people out there that it's happening to them, that even could be adults, right?
Absolutely.
Anybody.
There are examples after examples of coaches or teachers or stepdad parents or aunts or uncles or people who are having sex with adolescent children, right? It happens all the time. those people might be watching this because they're technological, right? They're internet friendly, and they might stumble across this video and say, wow, there are options for me. There are people I can contact.
Yeah. And
I
that's
don't have
another
to
reason
be,
I wanted to do it.
absolutely. I highly recommend that you look up. There is a wonderful person in California, Joelle Castiex, who's written some great books on this. I think she's a wonderful resource. There is just a tremendous amount of help available, but you have to not be afraid to reach out, and you have to just keep reaching out. If someone says no, go to the next person. If someone else says no, go to the next person. People will help you if you keep reaching out. There are people that will help.
There is actually, I know a lot of people are just too scared or don't know what to do or how to handle the situation. And like especially abused children in any way is, especially sexually, of course, but it really changes relationships with them, partnerships, relationships, friendships, and it can cause a lot of traumatic experiences, even more so, so that's the thing. It's like, talk to somebody, reach out, and really talk to somebody who you can really connect with and feel comfortable with, because you're married. I know you're now married, of course, and that. Yeah.
I don't know how I don't know how I was so fortunate to meet my spouse, who's tremendously supportive and has encouraged me all along to speak out, and has encouraged me to write the work on the book and write the book. And so I'm just so thankful. And she's been a part of this from the get-go. And as you probably guess, it's not easy to be, living with a traumatized person is not an easy thing, right?
No.
Living with a recovering alcoholic is not an easy thing. So,
Yeah.
so I'm so thankful for my spouse and her incredibly big heart and her supportive encouragement.
Yeah, because I always tell people, I said, you shouldn't judge anybody because you are not walking in their shoes.
Right. And it's so interesting how sometimes your birth family aren't the people that are going to help you. Sometimes
That's right.
the birth family is the toxic part of your life, right?
Yeah.
Take my situation, for example, right? When I first came out and I first really wanted to start telling my story, I have family members who tried to stop that from happening. And that's toxicity. That is shame. That is not what traumatized people need, survivors or victims or survivors need. What victims and survivors need is belief, and they need support, and they need love. And so some people in my family who are people of the cloth, right? They believe they're holier than thou, really discouraged. As a matter of fact, I went to a small newspaper in my hometown of Long Prairie, the Long Prairie Leader, and they had agreed to do a story until my sister-in-law, Mrs. Linda Dinkel, who is married to one of my older brothers, who knew of George being an abuser, and they knew that George was an abuser and didn't stop it, saying, calling that newspaper and saying, look, I don't think you should do this story. It's really going to embarrass our family, and he really wants to hurt the church, and he really wants to hurt the school. And that's not my mission at all. I don't care about hurting the church. I don't care about hurting the school, until I had a very interesting point the other day made to me by a friend on Facebook. Said to me, she said, you know what is interesting about your story? In the 2 years that you've been speaking out, you rarely mentioned your family, and you never mentioned Mrs. Linda Dinkel until she stopped your story from being printed. She said, your family interjected themselves into your story of trauma again. So the point being that the toxicity and the shame that these families and these institutions carry, right? Universities do it, the Boy Scouts do it, the Catholic Church does it, schools do it, right? Or organizations, Southern Baptist, there are so many organizations that carry this shame of hiding it. that they never wanted to get out,
Yeah.
right? So my family, even now, I started speaking out when I was 50 years old. These are adults that are in their 60s that still are conniving and working their way in small town Minnesota to stop this story from getting out, like decades later. Like,
Well, I
it's
won't.
the most,
So,
right, it's the most unloving thing you could ever do,
yeah.
right? Like, this person of Christ who believes that they're so holy and wonderful is that's one of them, a survivor. And so it's so important. And again, we're talking about those children reaching out. Remember that your family might not always be the people that are going to help you.
Yeah,
might be
mine didn't. Yeah, no.
might be
I was always the
complete
black sheep in my family, so
Yeah.
I've been on my own for years, literally. So,
Well, Jenny, I think we all have
yeah,
that one uncle or that one aunt that never came right to Thanksgiving or never came to Christmas or never,
yeah,
and we always wondered whatever happened to them or why. Well, now we're starting to figure out why, right? We're starting to figure out why, because they weren't treated fairly, or maybe something happened, or there was
reasons.
trauma,
Yeah,
right? There's truth behind the silence.
there really is. I'm an observer. I have been for forever, and but when I want to speak out and get a point, my voice is very loud. Very
Yeah.
loud, and it will continue to get louder. So, I'm very grateful that you took the time, to talk to me, Billy, like really, really grateful. So other people will know that it's okay to actually speak out and, start the healing and the process.
Well, I think that's, and I think that's part of, I think that not only is it healing for me, but it might be healing for someone who sees someone who's speaking out, and they suddenly find the courage in themselves to say, well, wait a minute, I have trauma. I want to talk about this because I need to. And then we show down the line.
Mhm.
Very briefly, I think it's very similar to HIV/AIDS. Until we talked about it, it was this dirty secret that didn't get funding, and we couldn't figure out how to cure it, and we couldn't. But once we started to talk about it to our legislators, we started to talk about it to Congress. Congress started to take notice, and then there was funding for scientists, and there's funding for doctors. And pretty soon, once we started telling them about the people we cared about who were suffering from these things, then the funding came, and then it wasn't so taboo to talk about. And that's what we need in the childhood sexual abuse world. We need to talk about these stories.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you again, Billy. I could talk to you forever, but my little internet thing here, like, I'm really nervous about it. It's kind of like shaking all around.
Well,
So
I hope it ends up.
yeah, so I don't want it to cut out. So is there any like last thing that you would like to share with us?
Well, I truly believe this, and I say this a lot on my Twitter page, and we talk about it on Facebook. I believe everyone has a story to tell,
Yes,
and I believe we are all made of light and love, and we are all part of something bigger than ourselves, and we owe it to the universe to talk about these things so that we can help encourage other people to heal.
absolutely. And that's why I do the work I do.
Yeah, and thank you for that.
Oh, that's why I do. I'm very good at it, and
Yeah.
I not to toot my horn, but
No, great.
yeah, that's exactly why I do that, and like to share with people, and people such as yourself out there even more so.
Well, thank you.
Yes, and I'm sure we'll talk again another time. And I just want to thank everyone for tuning in and watching, another episode of Soul to Soul Connections with Jeni. And for anybody who would like to connect with you, Billy, what would be the best way?
I think Billy, it's at Billy Dinkel, Billy with a Y, Billy Dinkel, Dinkel on Twitter, and then same on Facebook. It's Billy Dinkel, and we're still working on the website for the book, and we'll get that out there as soon as we can.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll chat again soon. You know, because like I said, there's so much more that we could have covered, but I'm just this whole internet thing, I don't know what's going on today.
If you think it's going to cut out, we're better.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I know it's literally like just all over the place. So I'm really a little nervous about it.
Well,
So
we'll see how it turns out. Thank you, Jeni.
oh, you're very welcome. And stay with me. Stay with me here. And again, everyone, you know, I want to thank Billy for coming on and sharing his story with us all. And you know, he is out there if any of you would like to get a hold of him to talk to him even more about this. So please subscribe to my channel and share this story. The world really, truly, truly needs to hear Billy's voice and Billy's story. So thanks everyone for tuning in again. Thank you.